Good morning, everyone. Our group was tasked to demonstrate the vertebral column. The vertebral column approximately consists of 50 irregular bones. They are arranged in groups mainly cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, and coccygeal or caudal. The number of bones in each vertebrae can be expressed in a formula: C7, T13, L7, S3, and CD20 or 223, although the number of caudal vertebrae may vary. The vertebral column serves as a support system for the body and is essential for providing stability and structure for the skeleton. It serves to protect the spinal cord and other internal organs and also provide attachment points. The vertebral column allows for proper locomotion in the body. To start the demonstration, we have the cervical vertebrae first.
Hello! So I'll be discussing cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae are the 7 vertebrae in the spine that make up the neck region. They are labeled C1 or the first cervical vertebrae through C7 or the 7th cervical vertebrae, and they are located between the skull and the thoracic chest vertebrae. These vertebrae are smaller and more flexible than their counterparts in the thoracic and lumbar regions, so they allow a wide range of head movement. The cervical vertebrae plays a crucial role in supporting our head, such as also protecting the spinal cord and enabling the mobility of our neck. The first vertebral, C1, also known as atlas, is the first cervical vertebral and it supports the skull. It's ring-like in shape and allows nodding for yes motion of the head. Unlike most other vertebrae in the spine, the atlas lacks a typical vertebral body, which is the solid central portion found in most vertebrae. The atlas doesn't have a protruding spinous process, the bony projection you typically find at the back of most other vertebrae. So the parts we can see here in the atlas, or also known as the C1, are the vertebral arc, this one, the wing, the sides, the transverse foramen, the lateral transverse vertebral foramen, and the alar notch. The groove here at this part. The second cervical vertebra is called the axis. The most distinctive feature of the axis is the peg-like projection known as the odontoid process or dens, which articulates with the atlas. The unique structure allows the head to pivot and rotate from side to side, enabling the no motion for the head. So in atlas, the motion is the yes motion of the head, while the axis is the no motion of the head. Here we can find the parts of the axis vertebrae. First is the spinous process. Second, the dens. This one is the cranial articular surface. This part here is the caudal articular process. This groove is the caudal vertebral notch. In the middle is the body. In this part is the transverse process, and again the whole is the transverse foramen. So the third cervical vertebrae up to the 5th cervical vertebrae are pretty much the same. Here is a picture of a third cervical vertebrae. Its parts are the spinous process, the cranial articular surface, the body, the transverse process, and the transverse foramen. So the 6 cervical vertebrae, unlike the upper cervical vertebrae, C6 has facets on its transverse process that can articulate with the ribs from the thoracic region. This is the beginning of the transition from the more mobile cervical spine to the more stable thoracic spine. So the part of the 6 cervical vertebrae is the spinous process, the transverse process, the body, the transverse foramen, and the cranial articular surface. So the last cervical vertebrae is the C7. So C7 has an especially long and prominent spinous process, which you can often feel as a bump at the base of the neck. C7 is the last cervical vertebrae that transitions from the cervical to the thoracic region of the spine. It is the boundary between the cervical and thoracic region. As such, it exhibits some characteristics of both regions. So the thoracic vertebrae has a very long spinous process, which is also can be seen in the C7. Unlike the upper cervical vertebrae, the C1 to C6, it lacks transverse foramina, the small opening that accommodates the vertebral arteries. Still, the parts of the C7 are it still has a spinous process, a transverse process, a lamina, a pedicle, the body, the vertebral foramen, the very big hole in the middle, the caudal costal fovea, and the caudal articular surface. So that is the last part of the last vertebra of the cervical region.
Moving on to the thoracic vertebrae. And just to be specific, thoracic vertebrae are the vertebrae that articulates with the ribs. And in human, there are only 12 thoracic vertebrae, but in dog, there are 13. And now we're going to focus on the dog. So, to simply identify the thoracic vertebrae is that it kind of looks like a giraffe. And it has body of intermediate size, and they distinguish by their long, slender spine and by the presence of the facets on the sides of the bodies, articulating with the head of the ribs. So it also has the vertebral foramen, which will enclose the spinal cord, and that are only the key items on how to identify the thoracic vertebrae. And right now, since I don't have the actual bone, what I'm going to present to you is the 3D model of the thoracic vertebrae. So this is the example of the thoracic vertebrae. And I'm going to discuss to you the functions, the description, how are they unique to the other bones. Okay, so let's start. This is the 3D model of the first thoracic vertebra. Okay, so the thoracic vertebra has a short vertebral body. This one here, the body, the vertebral foramen, or this hole, and the vertebral arch. Combining these two, the vertebral arch and the body, it forms the vertebral foramen. Let's talk about the body first. The thoracic vertebrae has its body, and that is the thick part of the bone of the centrum. It is the weight-bearing, and it makes it the inferior. The first thoracic vertebrae are convex or respectively concave, whereas the remaining thoracic vertebrae is plane surface, just like the 11th thoracic vertebra. So I have here one example. So moving on to the vertebral arch. The vertebral arch consists of different parts. This one, as what I've said, this is the vertebral arch. And it has the right and left pedicles. It also has the laminae, or the lamina, which are thick, short, broad, bony plates, and they join together to form a spine. This is the spine. It also has three processes, namely the transverse process, which is this these two. I mean, these, these are the transverse processes. The spinous process, this thing here, the spinous process becomes perpendicular to the body and the preceding vertebra incline caudally. And third, the superior articular process. These are the superior articular process, which are directed upward at the junction of pedicle and lamina. At the back also is the caudal articular process. These two. These are the caudal articular process. So the first through the 10th thoracic vertebrae have a cranial and caudal costal facet. This here is the cranial costal facet, these two, and at the back is the caudal costal facet. The head of the rib articulates with the cranial costal facet at the front. So, this is where the head of the rib articulates of the adjacent vertebrae and is a ball and socket of synovial joint. Similarly, the tubercle of the rib articulates with the transverse process of the vertebrae and is plane synovial joint. So here.
I am Andre Villanueva and I will be demonstrating the parts of the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae help support the weight of the body and protect the spinal cord. It also helps to protect the dog from potential injury, providing a strong connection points for muscles and ligaments. The lumbar vertebrae allow for mobility in the back and leg. The unique features of the canine lumbar vertebrae is that they have a broader body and a long plate-like transverse process. The transverse process are directed cranially as well as ventrolaterally. The lumbar vertebrae also have longer bodies compared to thoracic vertebrae. The articular processes lie mainly in the sagittal plane, and the caudal processes protrude between the cranial ones of succeeding vertebrae. The prominent blunt spinous process are largest in the mid-lumbar region, and the 7th lumbar vertebrae is slightly shorter than the other lumbar vertebrae. And this is a lumbar vertebrae in its left lateral view. This is the spinous process, and this is the mammillary process. This is the accessory process and the transverse process. This is the body, and this is the caudal articular surface. And the gap between the caudal articular surface and the accessory process is called the caudal vertebral notch. This is the cranial articular surface, and this is the caudal articular process. The spinous process serves as a dual function. First, it provides an attachment point for the spinal muscles, ligaments, and tendons, helping to hold the vertebrae together. Secondly, it is a stabilizing structure, helping to protect the spinal cord and its adjacent nerve. The mammillary processes of the canine lumbar vertebrae serve as attachment points for the ligamentous connections that provide stability to the spine. These processes are crucial for maintaining a stable spinal column and are involved in preventing excessive lumbar flexion. The accessory process is responsible for providing additional attachment for spinal muscles and ligaments. aiding in the stability of the spine. Having a strong accessory process and a stable lumbar vertebrae is essential for balance and mobility. The transverse process serves as an attachment point for the muscles of the abdomen and back, which help provide stability. It also provides an area of support for the intervertebral disc and contribute to the strength and flexibility. The bodies of lumbar vertebrae are longer and wider than the thoracic vertebrae. It is responsible for supporting the weight of the body and provide protection for the spinal cord and the nerve roots. There are two pairs of articular processes present in the lumbar vertebrae. The articular processes are responsible for the connection between adjacent vertebrae. The caudal vertebral notch serves as a point of articulation. It also helps protect the body structures and cartilage of the vertebrae.
I am COLALJO and I will be discussing the sacrum part. The sacrum is a shield-shaped bony structure that is located at the base of the lumbar vertebrae and that is connected to the pelvis. The sacrum forms the posterior pelvic wall and strengthens and stabilizes the pelvis. So these are the parts of the sacrum. First, we have here the cranial dorsal iliac spine. It is a bony projection on the upper part of the ilium, serving as a point of attachment for muscles and ligaments, contributing to the hip stability. Next, we have here the wing of ilium, the flat expanded portion of the ilium that provides structural support to the hip bone. We also have here the wing of sacrum. Wing of sacrum, it is the lateral part of the sacrum that connects with the ilium, contributing to the pelvic stability. Next, we have the dorsal foramina of sacrum. It is the opening in the back of the sacrum that allows nerves and blood vessels to pass through. Next, we have the caudal dorsal iliac spine. It is also a bony projection on the lower part of the ilium, also serving as an attachment point for muscle and ligaments. Next, we have here the promontory of sacrum. Promontory of sacrum, it is a ridge on the sacrum's front surface, marking the front of the pelvic inlet and playing a role in childbirth. We also have here the body of ilium. The body of ilium, it is the central main part of the ilium that forms the bulk of the hip bone. Next, we have here the iliopubic eminence. Iliopubic eminence, it is a bony prominence at the junction of the ilium and pubic bone, important for pelvic stability and muscle attachment. Next, we have a pecten of pubic bone. It is a ridge on the inner surface of the pubic bone, aiding the muscle attachment. Next, we also have here the symphysis of pubis. Symphysis of pubis, a cartilaginous point between the pubic bone, providing pelvic stability. We also have here the symphysis of ischia. It is also a cartilaginous point between the ischial bones, contributing to the pelvic strength. We have here the ischiatic table, the flat, weight-bearing part of the ischium. We have here the ischiatic arc, the curved structure formed by the ischium and pubic bone. Next, we have here the ischiatic tuberosity. Ischiatic tuberosity, a bony prominence on the ischium, supporting weight during sitting. Next, we also have here the obturator foramen, an opening formed by the ischium and pubic bone, allowing the passage of nerves and blood vessel. This is the lesser ischiatic notch. It is a small depression on the ischium near the ischiatic tuberosity. We have here the ischiatic spine, this part. It is a bony projection in the ischium, serving as an attachment point for ligaments and muscle. Next, we also have the greater ischiatic notch. It is a larger indention on the ischium. Next, we have here the body of sacrum. The body of sacrum, it is the central part of the sacrum providing spinal support. Next, we also have here the caudal articular process of sacrum. A bony projection on the lower sacrum involves in forming the sacroiliac joint. Next, we have here the gluteal surface of ilium. It is the outer surface of the ilium where the gluteal muscles attach. We also have here the crest of ilium, the upper edge of the ilium forming the prominent iliac crest. This is the sacroiliac joint, the joint between the sacrum and ilium, transferring forces between the spine and the lower limb. Next, we have here the cranial articular surface of sacrum. It is the upper surface of the sacrum articulating with the last lumbar vertebrae. And last, we have here the median sacral crest, this one. It is a ridge on the posterior sacrum formed by the fusion of sacral vertebrae. So that is the part of the sacrum.
Let us now proceed to the next part of the vertebrae of the dog, and that would be the coccygeal part. In dogs, the coccyx, also known as the tailbone, is typically composed of 20 to 23 vertebrae or coccygeal bones. This number may vary between breeds and the specific individual, which is the dog. The vertebrae starts at the sacrum or the last sacral bone of the dog. It attaches to this and continues with vertebrae, small vertebrae. Each preceding vertebrae keeps on progressing and simplifying its form. You see right here we have some processes, and right here we no longer have those very detailed spinous processes. In this illustration, we can see that the sacrum, and this is the caudal vertebrae number 1, which is the first vertebrae that signifies that this part is the start of the tail or the caudal vertebrae. Right here would be the cranial articular process. This is the caudal articular process, the transverse process. And that would be all for this illustration. Next is we have the cranial view of what a caudal vertebrae or coccygeal vertebrae would look like. Right here we have the caudal articular process, the cranial articular process, both of these. We have the vertebral arch, this part right here. We have the transverse process. We have the body of the vertebrae, the caudal vertebrae, and the humeral arch. And also, we have several foramina in most of the caudal vertebrae, which serves as the passage of nerves and nerve endings of the organism. Next is we have a dorsal view of what a vertebrae or the caudal vertebrae would look like. This right here is the cranial articular process. This right here. This here is a mammillary process, and this is the caudal articular process and the transverse process, which is located laterally of the dog. And that would be all for the illustrations. The unique aspect of coccygeal bones, or the coccygeal vertebrae of the dog, is their size and shape. They are much smaller and more rudimentary than the other vertebrae in the dog. Coccygeal vertebrae are often simple and small, and lack some of the features of the other vertebrates, like very detailed spinous processes or transverse processes. They are also generally more flexible, allowing for tail movement. We also have to keep in mind that specific characteristics of the coccygeal vertebrae can vary between the individual dogs and breeds. Some dogs may have the more developed coccygeal vertebrae, which they have long and bushy tails, while others may have fewer and more rudimentary coccygeal vertebrae if they are short-tailed or short-tailed or tailless dogs. And that would be all for the coccygeal vertebrae of the dog.